but violent burns marred his arm and shoulder and half his face. Some of them were severe. The unpleasant scent of charred flesh wafted toward the surgeon, making him cover his nose. He wasn't surprised that Lord Riverton wasn't breathing. Sometimes the shock of suffering such wounds was enough to kill. And this man was clearly dead. The valet had pressed his fingers against that still throat, had listened and felt for a sign of life. He would have sworn to its absence. He turned away sadly, prepared to tell the servants and the handful of houseguests gathered outside that the worst had happened. He took one step and stopped as a great rattling breath sounded behind him. Slowly, he turned to look at the man on the bed. The Marquess wasn't conscious, but his chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. The surgeon didn't know if anyone would believe him, but he was quite sure about this startling fact. The Marquess of Riverton had just returned from the dead. Chapter 1. Cassandra Davis was shirking her duties as the housekeeper of Blakewood Hall. She'd sent away Lord Riverton's houseguests, as the man in question wasn't actually conscious, and the staff didn't need aristocrats running about with no one to entertain them. Unoccupied aristocrats could be a bit like the sheepdog her family had once owned. Friendly when something was put in front of them to catch their attention, but rather inclined to tear up the furniture when there wasn't. But she didn't consider sending them away, neglecting her duties. Lord Riverton wouldn't want them there while he was incapacitated. She was certain of it. This, on the other hand, resting in a winged chair in the library while she perused the man's extensive book collection, was clearly shirking. But Lord Riverton would never know, and books were meant to be read. As long as none of the servants noticed where she'd been sneaking off to these past few days, no harm was done. Her fingers smoothed over the crisp parchment, almost lovingly. She jumped to her feet when the door opened with no warning. Heart in her throat, she turned, half expecting it to be Lord Riverton. But no. The master of the house wouldn't be visiting this lovely room any time soon. "Mr. Taylor," she said, relieved that it was the butler. She'd come to think of him as a friend, though he was at least 2 decades older than her. All of her brothers were younger than she was, and though she loved them all, they had been absolute terrors at the best of times. If she pictured what a kind older brother would have been like, Mr. Taylor always came to mind. In fact, he could sometimes be a little too kind with some of the lower servants, but she balanced him out by being stricter, and they worked well together. He might have been a handsome man when he was younger. Even now his dark grey hair and long face looked more distinguished than aged. He watched her curiously from the doorway. "Hiding away, Mrs. Davis?" "Of course not. What would I be hiding from?" He moved across the thick Axminster carpet to stand by the winged chair. Before she could protest, he'd lifted the book she'd been reading from the chair. "Latin?" he asked. "Can you read Latin?" "No," she said, suddenly embarrassed. "I was just indulging my silly fantasies. I was just looking," she responded, almost wryly. Mr. Taylor handed the book to her with a slight lift of his eyebrows, and she turned to the tall mahogany bookcases to replace the volume, pretending it was perfectly normal to find a housekeeper in her master's library looking through a book written in Latin. She didn't know what she'd been thinking, to start coming here after the fire. Well, perhaps she did. At first, she'd been thinking she was grateful the fire hadn't touched the library and all the beautiful